You are more reachable than any human who has ever lived. At any moment, someone can call or demand your attention. You've been taught to see this as connection, as progress, as a sign that you matter. But what if it's not? What if this endless availability is the very thing eroding your sense of peace? Your mind, once a sanctuary, has become a public hallway. Anyone can walk in unannounced. Every notification is a knock on the door of your consciousness. Every message pulls you away from yourself and into a world that demands performance over presence. Carl Jung warned, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." But how can you look inward when the outer world never stops knocking? We live in a culture that punishes silence. If you don't respond quickly, you're seen as rude. If you're unavailable, people assume something is wrong. We've built a society where privacy is suspect and stillness feels like failure. But maybe you're not broken for needing space. Maybe it's the system that's broken for teaching you that you must always be seen to be significant. This is the tyranny of accessibility. You've been conditioned to equate your worth with your responsiveness, to believe that being present in every conversation, every platform, every social loop is a virtue. But this constant connection is not a connection at all. It's exposure. You've become a product, a profile, a digital presence that must be maintained. You're always on display, always curating, always performing, and a performance can't rest. But you're not a brand, you're a human being. And human beings were not designed to be reachable 24/7. You weren't meant to stretch your soul across 10 conversations and 20 half-finished thoughts. You weren't built to live in fragments. So what happens when you stop answering? When you let the phone ring? When you leave the message on read? When you give yourself permission to disappear? What happens is simple but radical. You return. You return to stillness. You return to depth. You return to the parts of yourself drowned out by digital noise. Everything gets better when you stop being available. Not because the world changes, but because you do. Carl Jung believed we live behind a mask, not a disguise of deception, but one of survival. He called it the persona, the version of ourselves we present to the world. It's clean, predictable, agreeable. It fits into roles, earns approval, avoids rejection. But the more we refine this mask to meet expectations, the more we exile the parts of ourselves that don't fit. These forgotten fragments don't vanish. They collect in what Jung called the shadow. The shadow holds everything we've repressed: our unspoken anger, hidden desires, unprocessed pain, inconvenient truths. Not because they're evil, but because they don't match the image we think we must uphold. And here's the danger. When we're always available to others, we are constantly wearing the mask. The more we perform connection, the less we feel ourselves. The shadow is buried beneath politeness, urgency, and forced smiles. You respond to messages you don't want to answer. You say yes when your body screams no. You scroll endlessly, numb and wired at the same time. You stretch your identity across conversations until it thins into exhaustion. But the shadow doesn't forget. It waits. And when ignored long enough, it emerges through burnout, apathy, anxiety, and sometimes illness. Not because it wants to destroy you, but because it wants to be heard. Jung didn't believe the shadow was a flaw. He saw it as essential. Integration, he taught, is the path to wholeness. But integration requires space. It requires something we fear more than chaos. It requires withdrawal. Withdrawal doesn't mean running away from life. It means stepping away from noise long enough to hear your own voice again. It means putting down the performance and facing what you've buried. Modern culture treats solitude like a disease. If you're not available, something must be wrong. If you don't respond, you're labeled cold. If you don't show up, you're dismissed. But Jung saw solitude as sacred. It is in withdrawal that the shadow rises, not to punish, but to reveal. You begin to notice the grief you never named, the dreams you postponed, the instincts you ignored. This is not self-isolation. This is self-resurrection. But it's uncomfortable because the shadow doesn't flatter. It confronts. It asks, why are you still performing? Who are you without applause? What parts of you have you traded for approval? Yet in that discomfort, something rare happens. You begin to feel alive again. You begin to say no and mean it. You begin to rest without guilt. You begin to sense who you were before the world told you who to be. Withdrawal becomes less of a retreat and more of a reunion. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." To withdraw is to reclaim that presence, to stop being managed by the outer world and start being governed by the inner one. And that is the beginning of transformation, not the kind that comes from fixing who you are, but the kind that comes from finally facing who you've always been. In today's world, your attention is no longer your own. It's been turned into a commodity, bought, sold, and harvested by companies whose job is to keep you scrolling, reacting, responding. The platforms you use daily aren't just connecting you, they're conditioning you. Every ping, buzz, and red notification bubble is designed to trigger a response. Your brain, flooded with dopamine, starts chasing these digital crumbs. You feel restless when you're not checking your phone, anxious when you're not replying. This isn't accidental, it's architecture. You've been taught that being plugged in is being informed, that being reachable is being responsible, that fast replies mean you're doing life right. But this is a lie. And worse, it's a deeply profitable one. Tech companies measure success by engagement. They don't care if you're tired, anxious, or overwhelmed. What matters is that you're still clicking, still checking, still available. In this economy, your presence is less valuable than your attention, and your attention is only valuable if it can be manipulated. Carl Jung warned of a world where people live outwardly, but decay inwardly. And we're in it. We confuse movement with meaning, connection with performance, information with wisdom. But what happens when you never leave the stage? When your mind is always partially elsewhere? You become scattered, unfocused, easily led. You start to forget what deep thought feels like. You start to fear silence. You lose the ability to be alone with yourself. The attention economy thrives on this fear. It convinces you that boredom is a failure, that slowness is laziness, that introspection is unproductive. But Jung knew that the soul needs slowness. It needs withdrawal. It needs time. When you're constantly distracted, you are spiritually starved. You may be stimulated, but you are not nourished. This is why so many feel hollow despite being constantly connected. The connection is synthetic. It does not restore. It only drains. To reclaim your mind, you must first reclaim your attention. You must choose to be unavailable, not as a rejection of others, but as a radical act of presence, a refusal to be mined. The algorithms won't applaud. The world won't reward it, but your soul will recognize the silence. Your focus will begin to return. Your thoughts will start to have depth again. Availability is the default, but intention is the cure. You don't owe everyone a response. You don't owe every buzz your energy. You don't owe the system your soul. To stop being available is to remember what it feels like to truly belong to yourself. And that's where the real rebellion begins. History remembers the loud ones, the ones who stood on stages, shouted into microphones, led revolutions. But there's another kind of rebel, quieter, harder to notice, often misunderstood. The one who disappears. Disappearance is often seen as weakness, as avoidance. But sometimes it's something else entirely. Sometimes it's refusal. Friedrich Nietzsche walked alone for hours in the Swiss Alps, trying to hold his sanity together, while the world dismissed him as mad. Henry David Thoreau left behind city life to live deliberately in the woods. Emily Dickinson chose her bedroom over society, and from it produced some of the most powerful poetry ever written. These weren't acts of collapse. They were acts of confrontation. And then there's J.D. Salinger. After publishing The Catcher in the Rye, one of the most iconic novels of the 20th century, he vanished. No interviews, no book tours, no public persona. To the outside world, he was eccentric, reclusive, difficult. But maybe he wasn't running away. Maybe he was protecting something. In a world that demands explanation, disappearing is heresy. But these figures weren't interested in applause. They were seeking alignment. Their withdrawal wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. When you disappear from noise, you re-enter a dialogue with yourself. The distractions fall away, the roles dissolve, and what's left is raw, uncomfortable truth, often the only kind worth listening to. Jung understood this. He wrote about the retreat into the inner world not as a luxury, but a necessity. To withdraw is not to abandon life, but to recalibrate it. You don't have to vanish forever. You don't have to live in isolation. But there must be a place in your life where you are not performing, a space where you can think without interruption, feel without explanation, exist without validation. In a culture obsessed with visibility, silence becomes radical. In a world that measures your worth by how often you show up, not showing up becomes powerful. Sometimes the bravest form, your attention is on call, your emotions are outsourced, your identity is split across platforms. You've become a 24-hour broadcast of yourself, one that never gets to shut off. But there's a cost to this, one we rarely name. Availability without boundaries is emotional erosion. It teaches you to betray your needs in the name of politeness. It rewards you for self-abandonment. It convinces you that rest must be earned and that silence is rude. Carl Jung understood this danger. He wrote that modern life alienates us from our inner nature, that when we spend all our time reacting to the world outside, we forget who we are on the inside. When you're always on, you don't have time to process your own emotions. You say yes to things that drain you. You show up when your soul is begging for stillness. You make yourself available not because you want to, but because you're afraid not to. And that fear of missing out, of disappointing others, of being forgotten, keeps you chained to the mask. But here's the truth. Boundaries are not walls. They're bridges to your authentic self. Saying no doesn't make you selfish. Turning off your phone doesn't make you irresponsible. Refusing to explain your silence doesn't make you cold. It makes you whole. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are. And individuation is impossible without solitude, without saying, this space belongs to me. You can't heal in a room full of noise. You can't think clearly while performing. You can't grow when your energy is constantly leaking. The world will not ask you to set boundaries. It will take as much of you as you're willing to give. That's why you have to decide, what part of you is non-negotiable? What part of you is sacred? What part of you refuses to be available on command? When you reclaim your boundaries, you reclaim your energy. You begin to notice what actually matters. You learn to show up with intention, not obligation. You give yourself fully, but only when you choose to. And in doing so, you stop living as a reaction. You begin to live from the core, not out of guilt, not out of fear, but from something real, from something rooted, from something finally deeply yours. It sounds backwards. Disappear and you will appear. Retreat and you will return stronger. Say less and you will be heard more. But this is the paradox of disappearance, and it's one of the most misunderstood psychological truths. In a world obsessed with presence, pulling away feels like erasure. You fear being forgotten, left out, unseen. But the irony is this: the more constantly you are available, the less present you truly are. Because constant presence is not presence, it is dilution. You spread yourself across conversations, obligations, performances. You answer every message. You respond to every demand. You keep yourself visible so that no one forgets you, so that you don't feel left behind. But in the process, you vanish from your own life. Jung believed that withdrawal wasn't a sign of weakness, but a necessary step in becoming whole. In his view, we are not meant to be endlessly outward. The psyche requires inwardness. It needs darkness, silence, solitude, the fertile ground where transformation takes root. Yet modern life leaves no space for inwardness. The moment silence enters, we reach for noise. The moment stillness arrives, we numb it with stimulation. We avoid ourselves while pretending to be connected to everyone else. But when you finally pull away, the noise quiets. And in that quiet, something stirs. At first, it's uncomfortable. The thoughts you've ignored begin to surface. You start to feel emotions you've suppressed: loneliness, guilt, grief. You realize how much of your identity has been wrapped in responding to others. But then, gradually something changes. You begin to notice what truly moves you. You begin to hear your own thoughts clearly. You feel the pace of your breath, the rhythm of your mind, the truths that have been waiting for your attention. This isn't emptiness. This is emergence. Because the truth is, when you stop performing, you start existing. When you step out of the spotlight, you stop bending to its glare. And when you disappear from the chaos, you begin to inhabit your life again, from the inside out. There's a reason the mystics withdrew, the artists vanished, the philosophers disappeared into solitude, not to escape life, but to touch something deeper than life as it's been presented. In silence, you recover parts of yourself scattered by the world's demands. You stop chasing validation. You stop shaping yourself for others. You stop begging for permission to rest. And for the first time, you begin to see clearly. You are not your availability. You are not your productivity. You are not your performance. You are something deeper, something older, something that doesn't need to be liked, followed, or validated. Jung called this the path of individuation, the journey back to the center of your being, and it begins with the courage to disappear. You don't need to explain your absence. You don't need to justify your silence. You don't need to earn your solitude. You only need to claim it, because in a world where everyone is always visible, the ones who dare to disappear are the ones who finally come into focus. Maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're just loud in a way the world doesn't know how to hear. You think too deeply. You feel too much. You question what others accept. You pull back when the world tells you to push forward. And for that, you've been called distant, cold, difficult, even antisocial. But none of those words are true. You're not wrong. You're just rare. We live in a world that rewards the loudest voice, the brightest image, the fastest response. If you're not visible, you're irrelevant. If you're not always responding, you're fading. If you're not performing, you're forgotten. But here's what no one tells you. The ones who pull away aren't disappearing. They're preserving. Carl Jung knew this. He understood the soul doesn't grow under pressure to conform. It grows in the shadows. It grows in silence. It grows in those quiet, uncomfortable moments when you are finally alone with yourself. He called this journey individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not perfect, not approved, not applauded, just whole. But individuation isn't convenient. It doesn't look good on social media. It doesn't earn instant validation. It asks for solitude, for discipline, for courage. It asks you to step outside the current and walk into the woods alone, and you will be misunderstood for it. People will ask what's wrong. They will assume you're broken, depressed, avoiding life. They'll expect you to come back quickly, to explain yourself, to resume the role you've always played. But this time you won't, because you've seen what happens when you stay constantly available. You vanish. Not all at once, but piece by piece. In every yes that meant no. In every reply you forced. In every smile that covered silence. This is your manifesto. Not of rebellion, but of return. You are allowed to be unavailable. You are allowed to go unread. You are allowed to not show up. You are allowed to be a mystery. There is nothing wrong with wanting stillness. There is nothing shameful about disappearing for a while. There is nothing selfish about protecting your energy. In fact, it's one of the most honest things you can do. Because when you stop being available to everyone, you become available to what matters. To your intuition, to your creativity, to your healing, to your truth. This isn't about escaping life. It's about finally stepping into it, fully awake and without apology. Jung didn't ask you to abandon the world. He asked you to stop abandoning yourself. So to the quiet ones, the misunderstood, the burned out, and the boundaryless, the ones who don't fit the mold, this is your permission to slow down, to stop explaining, to pull back without guilt, to value your attention like a sacred resource. You do not owe your presence to anyone who treats it like a product. You do not owe your availability to a system that profits from your exhaustion. You do not owe your time to expectations that drain your soul. You owe yourself a life that feels like yours again. Now here's the reality. Choosing unavailability is not always easy. People might push back. You might miss out on certain opportunities. some conversations, some fleeting moments of inclusion. But those are surface-level losses. What you gain is something far deeper: mental clarity, emotional sovereignty, and the ability to make choices that come from a centered place, not a pressured one. There is a big difference between being liked and being respected. When you're always available, you may gain approval, but you often lose self-respect. When you set boundaries, some people might not like it, but they will begin to understand who you really are. Choosing to be unavailable forces you to confront a core truth. Not everything is meant for you. Not every invitation deserves a yes. Not every problem is yours to solve. Unavailability lets you prioritize, focus, and get honest about what actually matters to you. When you no longer say yes out of guilt or fear, your yes becomes powerful. It comes from alignment, not anxiety. You show up not out of obligation, but because you mean it. And that's how life becomes yours again. Yes, some people will misunderstand. Let them. Your path is not theirs to walk. Your silence is not theirs to fill. Because the truth is, everything gets better when you stop being available. Not because the world becomes easier, not because people change, but because you finally stop shrinking to be understood. You stop diluting your voice to be accepted. You stop bending your boundaries to feel safe. And you start becoming what you were always meant to be: whole, true, and finally, deeply free. If this video spoke to you, if you've ever felt the weight of what it means to think differently, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. And if you want more thought-provoking content like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's keep this conversation going, because it's time for more minds like yours to be heard.